I had guarded Paloma Spring 11 years, and I'd made my peace with dying beside it alone, the way a man makes peace with weather. Then the eastbound stage threw an axle on the grade above Adobe Wells, and the woman I'd buried in my own heart, a decade gone, stepped down into the dust 40 feet from me, shading her eyes against the same sun I'd been cursing all morning, and the peace I'd built for myself went to pieces in the time it takes a heart to skip. You have to understand what that spring was, out there in the Tornillo Basin, before you'll understand what came after. It was the only honest water for a day's ride in any direction. The Calabaza ran in spring and lied the rest of the year, a dry braid of sand by June. The seeps up in the Quemada Hills gave a tin cup an hour if you were patient, and the rattlers let you be. But Paloma came up cold and steady out of a black volcanic shelf at the foot of my place, year in and year out, drought or flood, and it had watered Apache and Mexican and Texan, and everything in between since long before any of us thought we owned it. 12 homestead families in that basin lived because of it. Their gardens, their few cattle, their children, all of it ran back, sooner or later, to that cold seam of water on my ground. I never asked them to thank me for it. The water wasn't mine. I only happened to live where it came out of the earth, and so the keeping of it had fallen to me, the way some things just fall to a man who will stand still long enough to take them. I'd come back from the war to find the valley half empty and my brother's grave gone over with cholla, and Ada married and gone east, and I'd decided, sometime in those first hard years, that a man who'd lost everything worth losing might as well make himself useful to the people who hadn't. So I guarded the spring. I kept the tank clean and the trough running and the channel open down to the Hartley place and the Vega place and all the rest. And when Royce Brevard's Crown B outfit came in with their bought land and their lawyers and their notion that whoever held the water held the whole basin, I'd stood between them and the spring with nothing but a level voice and a Spencer carbine I'd hoped not to use, and so far I hadn't had to. That was my life, and I'd have told you it suited me, the morning the stage came up the grade behind a tired six, and the off-rear wheel folded under and dumped the coach hard against the rocks. I was at the trough with 2 mules when I heard it, the crack, the shout, the squeal of frightened horses. I left the mules and went up the wash on foot, and by the time I came over the rise the driver had the team calmed and a man in a dusty broadcloth coat was helping passengers down into the shade of a Palo Verde. There were 4 of them, a drummer with sample cases, a rancher's son I half knew, a woman in gray, plainly dressed, with her hair pinned up under a traveling bonnet, and a child, a girl of maybe 7, clinging to the woman's skirt and staring at the broken wheel like it was a dead animal. The woman turned to settle the child, and the bonnet brim swung clear of her face, and the years fell away under me like a rotten porch board. It was Ada. Older, we were both older, with a fineness drawn into her face that the girl I'd known hadn't had yet, a quietness that comes from carrying things. But it was Ada. I'd have known her in the dark by the set of her shoulders. I'd known her since we were both children hauling water up from that same spring for our mothers, back when the basin was just our 2 families and a Mexican grandmother named Soledad who taught us both to read off a Spanish prayer book because there was no school. I'd loved her at 15 and at 20, and I'd carried her name into the war like a coal in my chest, and I'd come home to find her gone, and I had not said her name out loud in 11 years. I said it now. I didn't mean to, it just came up out of me. Ada. She went still. The child looked up at me, then at her. For a moment Ada didn't turn, and I had time to think every wrong thing that I'd dreamed her, that it was some other woman that I'd finally cracked from too much sun and solitude. Then she turned all the way around and her hand came up to her mouth, and she said in a voice that hadn't changed at all, Cole Maddox. It's me, I said. My own voice sounded like gravel under a boot. They told me you were dead. She said it plain, almost angry, the way you'd accuse a man of a debt. At the wilderness, they sent word back to the valley. My father read it to me himself. And there it was, 11 years late, the first turn of a knot I'd thought there was no untying. But I didn't understand it yet. All I understood was that she was standing in my dust with a child by her skirt, and the sun was murderous, and there was no shade worth the name for 2 hours' walk, and whatever else was true, that was mine to fix. "There's water and shade a quarter-mile down," I said. "Real water. Bring the child. The rest of you too," I said to the driver. "I'll send a boy to Adobe Wells for a wheel, but you'll wait it out at my place. No sense baking up here." So that is how I came to walk Ada Caro down my own wash to the spring I'd kept 11 years for strangers, with her dead husband's daughter holding my hand by the second 100 yards, because she was tired and I was the biggest thing offering, and a knot in my chest pulling so hard I could scarcely breathe around it. The girl's name was Tess. She told me herself gravely when I knelt to fill her a cup at the trough. "My name is Tess Caro, and I am 7 3/4, and that is the coldest water I ever drank in my life." I told her it was the coldest water anybody had ever drunk in the territory, which was near enough true, and something in her face unclenched, and Ada, standing over us, made a small sound that I think was meant to be a laugh and came out closer to the other thing. I got them all into the ramada I'd built off the cabin, mud and ocotillo shade where the air moved, and I drew water and put coffee on and sliced the morning's bread, and I sent the drummer's eager dollar back at him, and told the rancher's son to ride to the wells himself and rouse Prout the smith for a wheel. And all the while I felt Ada's eyes on me, not soft, not yet, but searching, the way you'd study a man you'd been told had died, to be sure of him. When the others had drifted to their own corners of the shade and the child had fallen asleep on a folded blanket with her mouth open, Ada came and sat across the rough table from me, and she put her hands flat on the wood, and she said, "You'd best tell me how you came to be alive, Cole, because I have grieved you 11 years, and I would like to know who I was grieving." So I told her. I told her about the wilderness, where there had indeed been a Maddox killed, a cousin of mine, Tom, from the Llano country, who joined the same regiment by an accident of geography. I'd carried Tom out of the fire myself and buried him under his own name, and I'd written it home to his people, and somewhere along the wire and the rumor it had come back to the valley as Cole Maddox dead. I told her how I'd come home in the fall of the second year after the surrender, half-starved and 3/4 broke, to find my brother in his grave and her father's house shut up, and the word in Adobe Wells that Ada Sumner had married a man named Caro and gone east to Kansas with his people, and good riddance to the drought, and had I heard. "And you never wrote," she said, "not a question." "You were married," I said. "What was I going to write? I held no claim on a married woman. I figured you'd grieved me and gone on and were happy, and the kindest thing I could do was let you be." She looked at me a long moment. Out past the ramada the heat shimmered off the white caliche and the doves came down to the trough 2 and 3 at a time. Finally she said, "I wrote to you before, while you were still gone to the war." Her voice had gone very careful. "3 years of letters, Cole, to the regiment, and then when the word came you were killed, I stopped. But before that 3 years, I never had a single word back." "I never got one letter," I said, "not one." We sat with that. The doves quarreled at the trough. Somewhere up the basin, a windmill I'd not got around to oiling squealed and went quiet, and I watched her work it backward in her mind the same as I was working it, both of us arriving at the same dark little room at the end of it. "My father," she said at last and stopped. I didn't make her say the rest. Old Hap Sumner had never thought a Maddox good enough to draw water off the same spring as his daughter, let alone marry her, and Hap Sumner had been the one to bring the mail up from the wells when there was any, and Hap Sumner had read her the news of my death himself, off a paper that, when I thought hard about it 11 years on, no one but Hap had ever actually seen. He was dead now, I knew. He'd died the winter after she left. So there was no one left to curse for it, which is the worst way to find out you've been robbed, when the thief is past your reach and there's nothing to do with the rage but carry it. "He's gone," I said, "these 9 years. "I know." She turned her cup slowly in her 2 hands. "Josiah, my husband, he was a good man, Cole. I want you to hear me say it plain because it's true and because the child sleeping there is his and loved him. He was a schoolmaster. He was kind to me and steady, and I made him a good wife, and I do not repent of it. But I want you to know I married a dead man's memory as much as I married him, and Josiah knew it and never once held it against me. She lifted her eyes. And now he's 2 years in the ground himself of the lung fever, and I am 33 years old with a child and a quarter-section patent my husband filed sight unseen out here before we ever married, and no money to speak of, and I have come back to the only country I ever loved to make a life out of what's left. I did not come back for you. I didn't know there was a you to come back for. Her chin came up. But here you are, so. Here I am, I agreed. It was the truest and the strangest conversation of my life, conducted in 11 years' worth of plain words across a rough table with a stranger's children know, her child asleep in the corner. And I want to set down, all these years later, that I did not feel joy in that hour. It was too big and too sharp for joy. What I felt was something closer to grief for the 11 years, for the man I might have been, for the children we might have raised at that spring, all of it stolen by one bitter old man and a clerk's mistake and never to be got back. You don't get those years back. Nobody does. The most you can do is decide what to do with the ones you've got left, and most men, me included, are slow to figure that part out. What I said finally was foolish and small and exactly right for who I was then. I said, "Your patent, Caro's quarter section, where does it lie?" Because that, you see, I could do something about. The rest of it I couldn't. She drew a folded paper from inside her traveling bag, a land office patent gone soft at the creases, and spread it on the table between us, and I leaned over it, and the bottom went out of my stomach for the second time that day. Josiah Caro's quarter section lay along the lower Calabaza, in the south of the basin, good bottomland, by desert reckoning, and it had been filed and proved up and patented clean 4 years back. But the description, when I followed it on the paper, and then on the map I carried in my head of every foot of that country, ran its north line straight across the channel that carried Paloma's water down to the lower homesteads. Whoever held that patent held the ditch. And whoever held the ditch could, if he chose, shut off every family below it. "Ada," I said carefully, "do you know what Royce Brevard would give to own this paper?" She didn't, of course. She'd been 2 years grieving in Kansas. She didn't know that Royce Brevard of the Crown Bee had spent 4 years buying up every relinquished claim and tax sale parcel in the basin, that he'd run 2 families out by cutting their fence and salting one well, that he'd offered me first $900 and then $1,500 for my own ground and the spring on it, and that when I'd told him the spring wasn't mine to sell, that it watered the whole basin and always would. He'd gone quiet in the way of a man who's decided to take by patience and law what he can't buy outright. She didn't know that the one thing standing between Brevard and the whole valley was the fact that the water came up on my ground and ran down through a tangle of small patents he hadn't yet got hold of. She held the most important of those patents in her 2 hands and hadn't known it. I told her all of it. I watched her face go from confusion to understanding to a flat, cold steadiness I remembered from when we were children and her father had whipped her brother, and she'd stood between them dry-eyed and dared him to start on her. She had not lost that. 11 years and a marriage and a grave hadn't taken it out of her. "Then he'll come for me," she said, "the way he came for the others." "He'll come gentle first," I said. "He'll offer to buy, he'll be sorry for your widowhood and your hard road. He'll make it sound like a mercy, and when you say no, he'll get patient." I looked at the sleeping child, and patient men like Royce Brevard have a way of making the desert do their unkindness for them so their hands stay clean. She was quiet. Then she said, "What would you advise me to do, Cole Maddox?" And there was the smallest crook at the corner of her mouth, 11 years old and brand new, and I understood she was asking me 2 questions at once and only meant me to answer the one. I answered the one. "Don't sell, not to him, not at any price. Prove up your residence, the pat's clean but a homestead wants living on and Brevard's lawyers will worry any thread they find. Move onto your ground, plant something. Make it plainly yours in front of God and the land office and the whole basin. I turned the pat so it faced her again. And let me help you do it. Not for I stopped. Just let me help. The water that runs through your ground is the same water I've kept 11 years. Your fight is the basin's fight now. You didn't ask for it, but it's yours. That's a great deal of help, she said, from a man I've known one afternoon in a decade. I've known you my whole life, I said. The decade's the part that's strange to me. And that, God help me, was the closest I came to courting her that first day. It was enough. I saw it land. She looked down at the patent and her ears went pink the way they had when she was a girl, and she said very low, yes, all right. Help me then, and we left it there, because the rancher's son was riding back down the wash with Proot the smith and a spare wheel lashed across his saddle, and the world that had stopped for an afternoon started turning again. The stage went on toward the wells at dusk with its drummer and its mended wheel. Ada and Tess did not go with it. There was no call to the Caro patent lay south in the basin, not east toward the railroad, and a woman come to take up her own land has no business riding past it on a stage. So I gave them the cabin and I took my blankets out to the ramada, and I lay a long time on my back looking up through the Ocotillo at the stars wheeling over the Quemadas, and I listened to the spring run, the way I'd listened to it every night for 11 years, and for the first time in all that while it didn't sound lonesome. It sounded like a thing that had been waiting too, and had finally got what it was waiting on. In the morning, I rode them down to see Caro's ground. It was better than I'd feared and harder than she'd hoped, which is the desert's habit. There was a fall-down jacal a Mexican family had abandoned years back, 2 rooms of mud and a stick roof gone to nothing. But the walls were sound and the floor was packed hard, and there was an old fig tree in the dooryard that had gone half wild and still bore. There was the calabaza, dry that month but with cottonwoods along it that meant water close under the sand. And there was the channel, the Paloma ditch, running across the north of the place clean and full and cold, the lifeblood of every family below it, riding right through the middle of Ada Caro's quarter section like a dare. She walked it all without a word, the child trotting at her heels nomming lizards, and at the end of it she stood in the dooryard of that ruined jacal with her hands on her hips and her bonnet pushed back, and she said, "We'll need a roof before the rains, and the well wants digging out, and I'll want a school." She said it like a list, like a woman who'd run a house and a husband's classroom and a child through grief and 1,000 miles of bad road, and had long since stopped letting the size of a thing frighten her. "A school," I said. "There's children in this basin, Cole. I counted 9 families on the ride down with children of school age. They're growing up not able to read their own deeds, which is exactly how a man like your Mr. Brevard prefers them." Her eyes had that flat, cold steadiness again. "I was a schoolmaster's wife 11 years. I can teach a school. And a woman who teaches the basin's children is a woman the basin will stand behind when the trouble comes. You taught me that yesterday without meaning to. The fight isn't mine. It's everybody's. So I'll make myself everybody's, and then we'll see what Mr. Brevard's patience is worth." I have known a few clever people in my life, and 1 or 2 genuinely wise ones, and I will tell you that in that minute, in the dooryard of a ruined jacal with a half-wild fig tree dropping fruit at her feet, Ada Caro showed me more sense about how to win a hard fight than I'd come to in 11 years of standing at the spring with a carbine. I'd been guarding water. She saw straight off that you don't save a basin by guarding the water. You save it by binding the people together so tight that no one man can buy or scare them apart, one family at a time. The water was the body of it. She meant to be the heart. I started that day, and I won't pretend it was only neighborliness. We put a new roof of cottonwood poles and arrowweed and mud on the jacal over the next 2 weeks, the Hartley men and old Eusebio Vega and his sons coming to help once word went round that the schoolmaster's widow meant to teach their children for the price of a roof raising. We dug out the well and timbered it, and it came in sweet at 11 feet. I rode to the wells and bought glass for 2 windows out of my own pocket and didn't tell her where it came from, and she knew anyway and let me. Tess took to following me at my chores the way A duckling follows the first warm thing it sees. And I taught her to set a snare and read the wind and tell a kingsnake from the kind that'll kill you. And one evening she fell asleep against my side by the cook fire, and Ada looked at the two of us over the flames a long while and didn't say anything, and didn't need to. I'd best tell about Royce Brevard now before I tell the rest, because a man like that deserves to be set down honest. He wasn't a brute. That was the trouble with him. A brute you can stand against and the whole world will stand with you. Brevard was soft-spoken and clean-handed and generous to the church at the Wells, and he genuinely believed, I think, that he was the future of that country and the rest of us were its past, and that a man who could make the desert pay had a kind of moral right to it that we squatters and seepwater farmers didn't. He'd come up from nothing himself, which made him pitiless toward everybody still in the nothing he'd climbed out of. He came to call on Ada 3 weeks after the roof was on, riding down alone on a tall gray horse with a hat that cost more than the Vegas saw in a year. And he was, I'll grant him, perfectly courteous. I was there. I'd made it my habit to be there. He didn't like that and he didn't show it. He admired the new roof. He admired the fig tree. He told Ada how sorry he was for her widowhood and how a quarter section in that country was a cruel burden for a woman alone, all sun and snakes and no neighbors worth the name, and how he'd be honored to take the worry of it off her hands at a generous figure in cash, so she could take the child somewhere gentler. He named $1,800. It was a great deal of money. It was more than the ground was worth to anyone, but a man who needed the ditch. Ada heard him out. She'd set him a chair in the shade and brought him water from the new well in a tin cup, the small courtesies, and when he was done she turned the cup in her hands the way she did when she was thinking, and she said, "Mr. Brevard, my husband filed on this ground sight unseen because he believed in this country. He died believing in it. I've come a long way to keep the faith he kept. The land isn't for sale. But you're welcome to water at our trough any time you ride through, the same as any neighbor." It was a beautiful no. It gave him nothing to push against. It made her the gracious one and him the grasping one, and it offered him the one thing, water, that he'd come to take, as a free gift, which made his wanting to own it look exactly as small as it was. I watched it work on him. I watched him understand that this widow was not the easy thing he'd ridden down to collect. "That's a Christian offer, ma'am," he said, and his voice was still soft, "and I'll remember it. I'll only say this. This is hard country and it gets harder. A woman alone, a little girl, the desert asks a great deal. I not want you to learn the cost of it the painful way." He set down the cup and stood and put on his expensive hat. "My offer stands. It won't stand forever and it won't stand so high again." And then to me, with a nod that had a blade folded inside it, "Maddox, you're a long way from your spring." "It runs down to here," I said. "Same water. I keep an eye on the whole length of it." He smiled like he'd expected nothing better of me, and he rode out, and the dust hung gold in the late light behind his tall gray horse, and Ada let out a breath she'd been holding, and her hand was not quite steady when she picked up the cup he'd left. "He means it," she said, "the part about the cost." "He means it," I agreed, "which is why we don't give him room to collect it. We keep you not alone. We keep the basin together. And we get ahead of him at the one place he means to win, the land office." That last part was hers again before it was mine. She'd been a schoolmaster's wife, and she had a schoolmaster's instinct for paper. While I'd spent 11 years guarding a spring with a carbine, Royce Brevard had spent 4 years quietly buying men's signatures, and the question Ada asked that I'd never thought to ask was, "Bought how and proved up how, and is any of it as clean as it looks?" "A pat's only as good as the proving up behind it," she said that night by the fire, with Tess asleep and the moon coming up huge and orange over the Quemadas. "Josiah taught me that he read law a little before he taught school. If Brevards bought relinquished claims and tax titles, some of them won't have been proved up right. Some of them the original filers may not even have known they signed away. There are men in this basin who put their mark on papers a Crown B lawyer put in front of them in a saloon and never understood what they were marking. If even one of those pats is bad, if even one of them can be challenged, then Brevard's whole string of ground has a hole in it, and water rights flow with the land. A bad patent above the ditch could undo his claim to the water entire. She looked at me across the fire. I can't ride a fence line, Cole, and I can't face down his men with a gun, and I wouldn't if I could. But I can read every paper in the land office at the county seat, and I can find the rotten board in his floor, and I can bring it into the light where a judge has to look at it. That's a fight I know how to win. I tell you, sitting there in the firelight, that I fell in love with her all over again, 11 years and a whole life later, not for her face or even for the old sweetness, but for the iron straightness of her mind. I'd been holding a line for a decade. She'd just shown me how to move forward. So we made our plan, and it was hers as much as mine. She'd ride to the county seat at Tres Alamos. It was 3 days each way by wagon, but the Hartley woman would keep Tess, and old Vega's eldest would drive her and stand by her, and she'd go through the land records family by family, claim by claim, and find Brevard's rotten board. And I would hold the basin while she was gone, keep the water running, keep the families looking out for each other, keep myself between Brevard's patients and the people he meant to wear down. And I would do one more thing, which I didn't tell her about until later, because I knew she'd argue it. I'd carry the truth of her own pat to the land agent at the wells and get it on record, witnessed and dated, that the Caro quarter section was occupied, improved, and not for sale, so that if anything happened to Ada, if the desert did Brevard's collecting for him the way I feared, there'd be no clean way for the Crown Bee to slide in and pick it up. I'd been a soldier. You secure your flank before you advance. She was my flank, her and the child both, and I meant to secure them whether she liked the soldiering in it or not. She was gone 12 days. They were the longest 12 days I'd spent since the war. I kept busy. I'd promised myself I would. I ran the ditch and cleaned the tank and rode the line, and I spent my evenings at one homestead or another, eating at their fires, because Ada had taught me without lecturing me that a basin holds together at the supper table or it doesn't hold at all. I'd lived 11 years among those families as the man at the spring, useful and apart, the way I'd arranged it. Now, with her gone, I made myself one of them. I held the Vega baby while its mother nursed the next one up. I helped the Hartley boy break a colt. I sat with old Eusebio in the blue dusk and let him tell me in his slow border Spanish about the basin when it was only his people in Soledad's and the Doves before any of us. And I understood for the first time that I'd been guarding their water for 11 years and had never once let them guard me back. A man can be lonesome in a crowd of people who die for him if he never gives them the chance. Tess stayed at the Hartleys but spent her days at my place because she'd appointed herself my apprentice and would not be talked out of it. She was a serious child, grave and watchful with her mother's straight gaze, and she'd lost a father young and was wary of growing fond of men. I could tell, the way a burned dog is wary of the hand. So I didn't push at her. I just let her be near and I answered her questions, and one afternoon while we sat in the Ramada shade shelling beans she said, without looking up, "Mama cried in the night the first week we came. After Mr. Brevard. I heard her. She shelled a pod. She doesn't cry anymore. Did you do that?" "No," I said. "Your mama did that. She's the strongest person I ever knew." Tess considered this. "She says you knew her when she was little like me." "I did. We hauled water from that same spring, your mama and me, when we were both no bigger than you. And then you went to the war and got dead." "Folks thought I did. I didn't, though. It was a mix-up, a bad one. It cost your mama and me a lot of years. I split a pod. But you can't get years back, Tess. You can only decide what to do with the ones you've still got." She shelled in silence a while. Then she put her small hand flat on my arm, the way her mother had put her hands flat on the table that first day, and she said, "I'm glad you didn't get dead," and went back to her beans, and I had to look hard at the quemadas for a minute so a grown man wouldn't make a fool of himself in front of a child over a bowl of beans. It was the 11th night Ada was gone, that Brevard moved. He did it the patient way, the way I'd known he would. He didn't come himself, and he didn't come at the spring, where I'd be watching. His foreman, a hard, quiet man named Tull, brought 4 hands down to the lower end of the Paloma ditch in the dark and threw a brush dam across it where it crossed onto Caro ground, choking the water back, so that by morning the 3 lowest families, the Vegas, the Hartleys, and a widower named Dunmore with 4 children, woke to a dry ditch and dying gardens in the worst heat of the year. It was perfectly deniable. A dam of brush and stone could be the work of a flash storm, an act of God, nobody's fault. And it sat squarely on Ada's ground, so that when she came home she'd find Brevard had made her the cause of her neighbor's thirst, the widow whose land had cut off the water, and would offer once more, all sorrow and reason, to take the burden off her hands. I'll tell you what I'd have done 11 years before. I'd have ridden to the Crown Bee alone in the dark with the Spencer, and I'd have made Royce Brevard understand the cost of dry gardens in language he'd remember, and maybe I'd have lived through it and maybe I wouldn't, and either way Brevard would have had exactly the story he wanted. The violent squatter at the spring, run mad, dealt with regretfully by lawful men. The patient ones always win that way, by making your rage do their work. I didn't do it. Ada had taught me better without ever sitting me down to it. I rode at first light to the Vegas and the Hartleys and the Dunmore place, and I rolled the men out, and I said, "This is Brevard. This is meant to look like weather and meant to scare us apart, and the answer is to do the opposite of scared." And I took every man and grown boy in the lower basin, 12 of us, and we went to the brush dam in broad open daylight where anyone passing could see, and we tore it out stone by stone and stick by stick. And we did it slow and orderly and unarmed, and we left every stick stacked neat on the bank like evidence, which is what it was. And while we worked, old Eusebio Vega's grandson, who had a good eye, made a drawing of the dam and the way it lay, and where the Crown Bee horses had stood. You could read their iron shoes in the mud plain as print, and we all of us put our names or our marks to the bottom of that drawing as witnesses, 12 men, that on such a date the water had been stopped by hands unknown, and the marks of Crown Bee horses were at the place. Ada had taught me that too, the night by the fire. A thing brought into the light where a judge has to look at it. The water ran again by noon. The gardens lived, and we had, for the first time, a piece of paper of our own to set against Royce Brevard's stack of them. Ada came home 2 days after that in the Vega wagon, gray with road dust and 3 days short of sleep, and the look on her face when old Eusebio's grandson showed her our drawing and our 12 marks pride, and a kind of fierce surprise, like a teacher whose slow pupil has suddenly worked the whole sum. I'll carry that look to my grave. But she had her own thing to show, and it was bigger than ours, and she could barely hold it in long enough to wash the dust off and kiss her daughter. She'd found Brevard's rotten board. In the land records at Tres Alamos, going family by family, claim by claim, she'd found that the keystone of Royce Brevard's whole string of ground, the upper claim, the one above the spring, the one whose water right made all his lower holdings worth having, had been built on a relinquishment signed by a man named Isaac Cruz, who had filed the original homestead, lived on it 3 years, and then, according to the Crown Bee's paper, sold his relinquishment to Brevard for $200 and moved on, clean enough on its face. Except that Ada, reading careful the way Josiah had taught her, found that the relinquishment was dated the 4th of a month in which, by another record entirely, a coroner's docket she only thought to check because the name nagged at her. Isaac Cruz had already been dead 11 days, kicked in the head by a mule and buried at the county's expense, with no kin and no estate. A dead man's mark on a relinquishment. Someone at the Crown Bee had needed Cruz's claim, and Cruz had inconveniently died before he'd sign it, and someone had signed it for him, and dated it wrong, and never imagined a schoolmaster's widow would 3 years later sit down with the coroner's book and the land book side by side and catch the dead man signing his land away. If the upper claim was bad, and a forged relinquishment for a dead man is as bad as it gets, then Brevard's title above the spring failed, and if his title above the spring failed, his whole claim to control the Paloma water failed with it, because water rights run with the land and you cannot hold the river by a deed built on a corpse's forged mark. The keystone was rotten. Pull it, and the arch came down. It has to go before the court at Tres Alamos, Ada said. We were at her table, the patent and her notes and our witness drawing all spread out together in the lamplight, Tess asleep and the spring running cold in the dark outside. Properly. With a lawyer there's an honest one at the county seat, old Mr. Quist, who hates the crown beyond principle. With the coroner's record certified and the land book and our witnesses to the dam. Brought into the light coal where a judge has to look at it. Not a gun fired, not a dam left standing, just the truth, laid down so plain that a man like Brevard can't buy or scare his way around it. She looked up, and the lamplight was warm on the iron straightness of her, and she said, "We can win this. The lawful way. The way that holds after the winning instead of just trading one strong man's gun for another's." We did win it, and I could tell that part long or short, but the truth is the winning of it isn't really the heart of this telling, so I'll tell it short. It took the better part of a year. Lawyers are slow, and courts are slower, and Royce Brevard fought it the whole way down, because a man like that does not give up a kingdom over one rotten board if there's a lawyer alive who will argue the board is sound. But the board was not sound. A dead man's mark is a dead man's mark, and old Quist laid the coroner's docket beside the relinquishment in front of the judge at Tres Alamos and read out the two dates, the burying and the signing, 11 days apart. And there was nothing Brevard's money could do about a corpse that had signed away land it no longer breathed to hold. The upper claim was thrown out. Brevard's control of the water failed with it. And the judge, who was no friend to either side but had no love for forgery, ruled the Paloma a public water, to be shared by all the lands it had always watered, with no one man's deed standing over it. The spring I'd guarded 11 years with a carbine was made safe forever by a schoolmaster's widow with a coroner's book, and not one shot was fired in the whole of it. Brevard sold out within the year and went to California, where I'm told he did very well, men like that generally do, and I wished him no harm and gave him no further thought. The basin held. The family stayed. Ada's school opened in the front room of the rebuilt jacal that fall and grew until we raised a proper schoolhouse for it 2 years on, of adobe brick the whole basin made together, with 2 glass windows I paid for and let everyone know at that time. The basin's children learned to read their own deeds, just as she'd said, and grew up unfit to be cheated, which is the best gift you can leave a hard country. But none of that, the winning of it, is what I set out to tell. What I set out to tell is what happened the night she came home from Tres Alamos that second time, with the rotten board found and her daughter asleep, and the lamp burning low, and the 2 of us standing in the dooryard under the same stars I'd watched alone for 11 years. I'd not courted her. There hadn't been time with the water and the law and the work, and the truth is I'd been afraid to. 11 years is a long time to mourn a thing, and I think some part of me was afraid that the wanting of her was just an old habit of grief, and that if I reached for the living woman I'd find I'd only ever loved the dead idea. So I'd hung back. I'd been useful and near and careful, the way I'd been all my life. She put an end to it in the dooryard that night, the way she'd put an end to Brevard, plainly, and without giving me room to retreat. "Cole Maddox," she said, "I am tired. I have driven 6 days and read a dead man's lie out of 2 county books, and I mean to win this basin its water back. And I have not got the strength left over to spend on a man who keeps me at arm's length out of some notion that he hasn't the right." She looked up at me, and the iron was in her, but under it was the girl who'd hauled water with me at that spring 40 years gone. We lost 11 years to one old man's bitterness and a clerk's mistake. I will not lose what's left of them to your humility. You said it yourself to my daughter, I heard you, that you can't get the years back. You can only decide what to do with the ones you have. So decide. Out loud. Now. Because I have decided, and I am too old and too tired to do it for both of us. I have never been a man for speeches. I'd guarded a spring 11 years and said maybe 1,000 words a year, most of them to mules. But I found the words then. I said, I loved you when we were children and I carried your name through a war and I mourned you 11 years and I never once stopped, not for an hour, not in all that time. I thought I'd buried it. I hadn't. The day you stepped off that broken stage, it came up out of me whole, like the spring comes up out of the rock, cold and steady and never gone dry. I don't want what's left of my years to belong to me alone. I want them to belong to you, and to Tess, and to whatever life the three of us can make on this hard ground. If you'll have a worn-out man who's better at keeping water than keeping his own heart in plain words. I took a breath. Will you marry me, Ada? Not to save the patent, and not to fight Brevard, and not for the water. For nothing but that I love you, and have my whole life, and mean to spend what's left of it making up for the part somebody stole. She didn't make me wait. That was always the difference between us. I'd have hung back a year over a thing she'd settle in a breath. She stepped in and put her 2 hands flat on my chest the way she put them flat on a table when she'd made up her mind, and she said, yes, you worn-out, water-keeping, slow-spoken man. Yes. And then she said, against my shirt, so low I felt it more than heard it, 11 years. We'll just have to live the harder to be even. We married that winter, in the front room that would be the school, with the whole basin packed in shoulder to shoulder and old Eusebio Vega standing up for me, and the Hartley woman for her and Tess holding the ring on a bit of ribbon, grave as a judge. We lived on the Carrow ground and worked it together, and we kept the spring, and the basin grew up around us the way a thing grows up around good water, slow and stubborn, and green out of all proportion to the dry country that holds it. Tess took my name when she was old enough to ask for it, and called me Pa from the spring of that first year, careful at first the way she was careful about everything, and then easy, and then like she'd never called me anything else. We had 2 more in the years after, a boy and a girl, both born in the room where the fig tree drops its fruit, and all 3 of them learned to read at their mother's school, and to find water in a dry country at their father's side, and not one of them was ever a soul that a strong man could buy or scare, which was the whole of what we'd set out to give them. I am an old man now, and Ada older, though she'd skin me for saying it, and we sit most evenings in the dooryard of a house that long ago stopped being a fall-down jacal, and we watch the doves come down to the trough the way they came down the first day, 2 and 3 at a time, and we listen to the spring run. It still comes up cold and steady out of the black rock, drought or flood, the way it has since before any of us and will long after. I guarded it 11 years thinking I was keeping it for strangers. I know now I was keeping it for her, and for the girl who'd hold my hand down the wash, and for the family the 3 of us would make, keeping the water alive in the dark all those years so that one morning a broken axle on the grade above Adobe Wells could put my first love back beside it, with her whole life still in front of her and just enough of mine left to share. You can't get the stolen years back. Nobody can. But I'll tell you what I learned late, the way I learned everything. The ones you've still got if you spend them right beside the right person by good water in the company of children who will grow up unafraid, those ones are enough. They were enough for me. They were more than I ever thought to be given, sitting alone at that spring 11 years, making my peace with the weather. She's calling me in now. The lamp's lit and the doves have gone to roost and the water's running, and I have, at long last and against all the odds a hard country lays against a man, exactly everything I want. I'd best go in. A man shouldn't keep her waiting. We lost enough years to waiting, the 2 of us. We agreed, a long time ago now, never to lose another.